Christina Alney, and I am the Director of Government Relations for the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation. And I would now like to welcome our President and CEO, Ambassador Andrew Bremberg, who will introduce today's program and our speakers. Thank you, Ambassador Bremberg.
Thank you, Christina. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today, both here in person and online. As Christina mentioned, we observe today Captive Nations Week, first called for by a congressional resolution and proclaimed annually by every president, from President Eisenhower in 1959 to President Biden just last week. We as a nation, during this week, we commit ourselves to stand in solidarity with the nations around the world held captive by communism. 30 years ago, we all rejoiced when millions around the world were freed of communism, and most of the nations originally listed in the Captive Nations Resolution were liberated, not by force, but by their own people. This includes the Ukrainian people, who voted for independence in 1991 and regained their sovereignty. Shockingly, today we are witnessing the horror of war as Russia attacks and invades Ukraine, killing untold thousands and committing countless war crimes. But Ukraine will not be held captive again. Once again, the Ukrainian people have spoken, not just in their words, but in their daily acts of heroism as they bravely fight to defend themselves. So as we commemorate Captive Nations Week this year, let us recommit ourselves to stand with Ukraine, with the people of Ukraine, as they stand and fight for freedom. It is now my honor to present two welcome video remarks we'll have. The first is from Ambassador Paula Dobriansky. She is the Senior Fellow in the Future of Diplomacy Project at Harvard University's JFK Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs, and is Vice Chair of the Scrowcroft Center for Strategy and Security for the Atlantic Council. From 2001 to 2009, Ambassador Dobriansky served as Undersecretary of State for Global Affairs and established and led the U.S.-India, U.S.-China, and U.S.-Brazil Global Issues Forum. She was also head of the delegation and lead negotiator on U.S. climate change policy. Ambassador Dobriansky received a BSFS summa cum laude in international politics from Georgetown University's School of Foreign Service, and an MA and PhD in Soviet political military affairs from Harvard University. Ambassador Dobriansky is a trustee here of the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation and the daughter of Ambassador Lev Dobriansky, the author of the 1959 Captive Nations Week resolution. We will then have a welcome video from Acting Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary Scott Busby of the Bureau of Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor at the U.S. Department of State. He oversees the Bureau's work on East Asia and the Pacific, the Western Hemisphere, business and human rights-based sanctions. He previously served as the Director of Human Rights on the National Security Council of the White House and as coordinator of the international consultations on migrations, asylum, and refugees in Geneva, Switzerland. He holds an advanced degree in sociology and law from the University of California, Berkeley, and received a BA from Amherst College.
Thank you, Ambassador Bremberg. I'd also like to recognize Dr. Ed Fulner, our chair, as well as Chairman Emeritus, Dr. Lee Edwards. Thank you both for being here today. And also thanks to all of our Board of Trustees members. Your support has been truly indispensable. Distinguished ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Captive Nations Week Summit. Today we come together to advance that noble goal articulated in Senate Joint Resolution 111, passed on July 17, 1959, and signed into Public Law 8690, a law which has remained in force to this very present day. Captive Nations Week was conceived to spotlight and condemn the continued suffering of those victimized nations and people living under communism. Some of the nations listed in the original legislation are now free, but there are those populations in the world who continue to remain subjected to communist rule, to authoritarianism, and totalitarianism. My father, Ambassador Lev Dobryansky, a professor at Georgetown University and chair of the National Captive Nations Committee, would be incredibly proud if he were here today. As a fierce anti-communist and champion of global freedom and democracy worldwide, he wrote the first Captive Nations Week resolution in 1959, and which was signed into law by President Dwight D. Eisenhower. The resolution calls upon every president of the United States to proclaim the third week of July of each year as Captive Nations Week, and urges Americans to, quote, reaffirm their commitment to all those seeking liberty, justice, and self-determination, unquote. Across the globe, many nations and people continue to be subjected to crimes and injustices perpetrated by tyrants. So many have put their lives on the line to support the universality of human rights. Captive Nations Week is a reminder to future generations to never take liberty for granted. And it is also a pledge to those who still live under oppression that we will neither forget them nor abandon them. Thank you so much for being here today, and also thank all of you for your sacrifices and your staunch commitment. Let us recommit ourselves to defending and promoting liberty for future generations. Thank you.
Thank you for the opportunity to speak today, and thank you to the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation for organizing this important event. History has shown time and time again that democracies are more peaceful, prosperous, and secure. Democracy also remains the best form of government for defending and promoting fundamental freedoms and human rights. That is why President Biden convened the Summit for Democracy, and that is why the U.S. government remains committed to promoting democratic governance wherever we can and pushing back against authoritarian governance and the repression that goes along with it wherever it appears. Unfortunately, not everyone has the privilege to live in a free and democratic society. For this reason, we welcome the opportunity provided by Captive Nations Week to call attention to those countries that remain under the yoke of authoritarian and totalitarian rule. One such country is Russia. At this moment, the world is witnessing Russia's brutal, full-scale invasion of Ukraine. Along with the international community, we will continue to condemn Russia's unprovoked and unjustified war and its violence and atrocities against the people of Ukraine. The United States will also continue to work closely with the international community to hold Russia accountable for its disregard of international law and human rights, as we did last week at a meeting convened in The Hague. This includes not only the war crimes and abuses committed by Russian forces in Ukraine this year, but also the forced disappearances, torture, arbitrary detention, and other human rights abuses in Ukraine since 2014, for which Russia is responsible. At the same time, President Putin and the Russian regime continue to repress Russia's own people by stifling its civil society, censoring free expression, and increasing repression against human rights defenders and journalists, including those seeking to shine light on Russia's actions in Ukraine. These actions show clearly how the Kremlin's repression at home is linked to its disregard for the international rules-based order and human rights abroad. The People's Republic of China is another regime responsible for numerous atrocities and human rights abuses, including harassment, enforced disappearances, forced labor, torture, and restrictions on freedom of religion or belief. The PRC employs repressive policies to silence human rights defenders and members of religious and ethnic minority groups, such as Tibetan Buddhists, Christians, Falun Gong practitioners, and Muslim minorities. The Secretary of State has determined that since 2017, PRC authorities have committed genocide and crimes against humanity against Uyghurs, who are predominantly Muslim, and members of other ethnic and religious minority groups in Xinjiang. These crimes include the detention of over 1 million people in internment camps and detention centers in Xinjiang, torture, forced sterilization, and persecution, including through forced labor, and draconian repression of the freedoms of religion or belief, expression, and movement. The Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation has done a wonderful job in helping to document these acts. More broadly, PRC authorities use intimidation, harassment, invasive surveillance, enforced disappearances, and other forms of coercion to exert control and silence criticism among its population. In some cases, we've seen PRC authorities seek to exert this control even outside its borders, using transnational repression through brutal tactics that include physical threats, harassment, and surveillance against individuals, threatening individuals' family members within the PRC, digital threats such as online harassment, and misuse of international law enforcement systems such as Interpol. While the situation in the PRC, Russia, and Russian-controlled areas in Ukraine are crucial concerns, there are many other places where freedom is under threat, as we are witnessing democratic backsliding and increasing human rights abuses around the world. That is why creating a community that allows for democratic renewal is key to promoting and protecting human rights and fundamental freedoms against communist and authoritarian threats. As members of the free world, we must jointly promote our democratic values, and we must hold ourselves and our allies accountable to our democratic commitments. The United States will continue to promote democracy and protect liberty for everyone around the globe. Thanks again for convening this conference, and I look forward to hearing the outcomes of your discussions.
After those great introductions, I'm pleased to now bring us to our panel discussions. So we will have two panels this morning. The first panel will be led by Milda Boyce, the Director of Fellowships here at the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation. And panel one the topic will be Putin's war against Ukraine and the future of Russia. And I will allow Milda to introduce the panelists when they begin. And the second panel will be led by Carlos Ponce, the Director for Latin America Studies here at the Victims of Communism Foundation. And the panel will be discussing the lessons of Ukraine for captive nations around the world. Milda?
Thank you, Ambassador. I'm Milda Matachunete Boyce, Director of Fellowship Programs at Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation. And I'd like to welcome everyone joining us today in the audience and tuning in online for a panel discussion focusing on Putin's war against Ukraine and the future of Russia. Russia continues to intensify attacks on Ukrainian cities and expands disinformation campaigns across Eastern Europe and beyond. Innocent civilians and children in Ukraine have become daily casualties of this brutal war. The headline news are spinning between scenarios. What if Russia wins? What if Russia loses? How about what if Ukraine wins? So to put things in perspective, I would like to ask our leading experts on this subject matter to share their insights on the current situation in Ukraine, but also focus on the future of Russia, future of Ukraine and the entire region as a result of this war. A few questions that I'd like to pose ahead of your presentations, if you could think about what are possible scenarios in Ukraine and Russia in the foreseeable future, 1 to 5 years from now. What do you see happening in terms of Ukraine's position in the face of ongoing Russian attacks and its imperial aims? And what are the concrete steps that allied countries such as the US and most of Europe could do to help in hopes of establishing peace and sovereignty in occupied territories of Ukraine and turn the wheels towards constructive democratic changes in Russia? And with that, I am honored to introduce our distinguished panelists. On my right is Dr. Marek Jan Kodakiewicz, is the Kościuszko Chair in Polish Studies, Head of the Center for Intermedium Studies and Professor of History at the Institute of World Politics. His research interests include the post-Soviet zone, the Second World War, and its aftermath, Europe in the 19th and 20th century, Western civilization and its intellectual tradition, extremist movements in history, conspiracy theory and practice, and comparative civilizations. In addition to numerous popular and scholarly articles, Dr. Chodakevich authored, co-authored, edited, and co-edited over 15 scholarly monographs and documentary collections in both English and Polish. His latest include Intermarium, The Land Between the Black and Baltic Seas, which is a depiction of the eastern borderlands of the West on the rim of the former Soviet Union. Dr. Chodakevich holds a bachelor's degree from San Francisco State University and master's in philosophy and PhD from Columbia University. On Dr. Chodakevich's right is Michael Sokiv, who is Executive Vice President for Ukrainian Congress Committee of America and Director of Ukrainian National Information Service. Mr. Sokiv's efforts and key goal at the Ukrainian Congress Committee has been to ensure unity among America's European allies, challenge Russia by freezing assets of 4 banks that were sanctioned by the Biden administration, and continued efforts to revoke Russia's admission in SWIFT. Mr. Sokiv has a longstanding professional expertise in nonprofit organizations, policy analysis, politics, government, and strategic planning. He was an associate in AIG Financial Products from 1993 to 1996. Mr. Sokiv has a master's degree in Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute, the Lally School of Management, Corporate Finance, and International Business. And last but not least, Brian Whitmore, my good friend and former colleague, is an adjunct assistant professor and Russia specialist at University of Texas Arlington McDowell Center for Global Studies and a non-resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council's Eurasia Center in Washington, D.C. He is also the founder and author of the Power Vertical blog and host of the Power Vertical podcast, both of which focus on Russian affairs. From April 2018 to July 2020, he worked as a senior fellow and Russia program director at the Center for European Policy Analysis. Whitmore also worked as a senior Russia analyst for Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, where he was employed for 11 years from 2007 to 2017. Prior to joining RFERL, Mr. Whitmore worked as a foreign correspondent for the Boston Globe in Moscow and in Prague. He has worked as a graduate lecturer in the Department of Government and International Studies at the University of South Carolina and as a visiting lecturer in the history faculty at Meshnikov National University in Odessa, Ukraine, and the international relations faculty at St. Petersburg State University in Russia. His work has appeared in the Washington Post, The Atlantic, The New Republic, Foreign Policy, World Politics Review, Newsweek, and elsewhere. He has appeared as a guest commentator on CNN, the BBC World Service, NPR, Bloomberg, and various other media. A native of New Haven, Connecticut, Mr. Whitmore earned his master's degree in political science from Villanova University in 1987 and bachelor's degree in politics from St. Joseph University in Philadelphia in 1986. Welcome to everyone. We will now ask each panelist to deliver their remarks before we field questions from the audience. Since we only have 1 hour, I will kindly ask our panelists to keep your remarks brief, up to 10 minutes, to make sure we have sufficient time for the Q&A. And let's proceed in the alphabetical order. Dr. Chodakevich, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Let's see. Thank you very much. I hope everyone can hear me. I would like to thank the Victims of Communism Foundation and Milda for her kind introduction and the opportunity to speak. I would like to thank you for caring and showing up. Sven should be retired and he's here. Thank God. First of all, I'm very, very happy that VOC has provided a platform to our old alliance, the captive nations. Some are lucky, like Lithuania and Poland and Hungary and so forth, for they are free and not threatened directly yet. Others are unlucky, like Cuba, Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia. They are still occupied and unfree. There is a in-between house, so half house for victims of post-communism like Angola, Mozambique, and perhaps Ethiopia. I would like to see the coalition restitched and working together as it had back in the 1970s and 80s, and then suddenly most must have believed in the end of history. Well, Putin has proven in Ukraine that history has not ended, if anybody needed proof. What's next as far as Russia and Ukraine? Well, the most important thing is to understand that Ukraine is not the Ukraine, but Ukraine is perceived as an existential threat to Moscow, at least on two levels. Level number one is the imperial project, which is incomplete without Ukraine in particular. Everything else is on the menu too, including the Baltic states, Lithuania, Estonia, Latvia, and Poland, of course, and everybody else. To what degree, we don't know, but Ukraine is a sine qua non of putting back the empire together. Russia always feels threatened, and Ukraine threatens Russia horribly because Russia only has 9 time zones. It wants the 11 time zones it used to have back, and then it'll be happy and feel secure for a while. Now, Norwegians think that because historically they had not been under Russia, they're safe. Says who? Where does it stop? That's the logic of any empire. Imperialism is a crime of opportunity, and people used to smile when I said, well, it doesn't have to be Ukraine or Estonia. Kazakhstan's on the menu too. Everyone is. You don't have to be paranoid to recognize the dynamics. That's simply how it works. First, Ukraine threatens the imperial project. Second, Ukraine threatens the cultural and historical narrative of Muscovy. It's very important because Moscow claims the mantle to Ruthenia, to Rus, Kievan Rus. It's like saying that Canada, because it's English-speaking, claims Florida from the United States and then everything else. At any rate, last fall, Moscow, Putin had 3 moves. Some in this town were worried about Belarus on the account of Minsk unleashing waves of so-called refugees against the Lithuanian and Polish borders. But this was just a sideshow. Ukraine was main stage. That's where Russia concentrated its troops. And there were 3 moves. First one was swaggering. This was a possibility. Putin was hoping to pressure the European Union to allow Nord Stream 2. Second move was a land bridge to Crimea, which would have been in character for Putin, for he wanted to continue his incrementalism. Well, what we, or most of us, did not take under our consideration was that Putin learned that he was not immortal. So it was an all-out war. That was his option. Well, Putin's war did not go so well. Ukraine was, of course, on the receiving end and losing from day one simply because of the overwhelming numbers and inability of the Ukrainians to mount a counteroffensive and wipe out the invader. Ukraine has been on the defensive from day one, but the all-out option didn't work out so well for Putin, as you know. So the Russians switched to what they know best, creating pockets and bearing overwhelming force against points of resistance. It's not that the Ukrainians are not brave. They've been fighting like lions, but not too many troops are happy to see civilians die. And not too many enjoy seeing Ukrainian cities which refuse to surrender reduced to rubble so that the Muscovites could rebuild them according to their own terms, with Lenin Square instead of Independence Square. The Russian armies have been moving from one target to the next. They have realized this was the best way. They don't have considerations that civilized armies do. Their byword has always been, "U nas mnogo ludzi," we have a lot of people. They don't care. And Putin has no incentive to stop. Unless he finds one, he's going to go on. Perhaps more slowly, but more thoroughly, with more death and destruction. So what if he stops? Well, we also have to realize that this is not about Putin. It's about the Muscovite culture. Lenin, this great lover of peace and equality, inherited the Tsar's empire and the Tsar's geopolitics. So he just proceeded to restitch what had been the empire of the Romanovs in precisely the same way. Please read Professor Kuchajevsky. His thesis was popularized in the United States by Richard Pipes, one of the greatest historians of Russia. There is a straight line in terms of imperialist imagination from the Tsar to the Soviets. If Putin stops his offensive, he'll restart it. If he dies, he disappears from the scene. When he's gone, someone else will restart it. This is just the Muscovite imperial logic. I know that many were tempted back in the 1990s to see not only the end of history, but also the beginning of a new Russia. There was a little bit of hope, but the hope rested in Novgorod the Great, not Muscovy. So that didn't work out and became obvious very quickly. Please remember that Yeltsin bemoaned the disintegration of the Soviet Union. When Yeltsin created the Commonwealth of Independent States, it was to destroy, pardon my Marxism, the superstructure of the Soviet Union, which was beholden to Gorbachev. Creating the Commonwealth of Independent States was just getting rid of the party and Soviet bureaucracy. Yeltsin assumed everyone would stay together if the largest states, so-called independent states, remained together with Ukraine and Kazakhstan, etc., everything would be honky-dory. That was not the case. So Yeltsin and many of his people were upset. This was not Putin who invented this sentiment. Already Yeltsin vowed to address this problem in some way. Putin just became the most outspoken proponent of it. There is no raison d'être for Ukraine. Ukraine must not exist if the imperial project is to succeed. Well, don't worry. Everybody else is on the menu too. Putin's geopolitical guru, Alexander Dugin, said there's no place for Poland on the map. It's just completely superfluous. Europe starts with Germany. And this is simply imperial logic, and that's how it's going to be, and that's what we should expect until Muscovy is reduced to its medieval shape, and other regions of the Russian Federations are allowed autonomy, at least, and some kind of independent existence. Now, I'm not here to call for the destruction of Russia, because the West needs a balancing act beyond the Urals so the Chinese wouldn't visit. And with that thought, I would like to thank you very much.
Thank you, Marek, for such an important historical perspective. Michael, please go ahead.
Thank you, Milda. Thank you for the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation for hosting this particular conference during this Captive Nations Week. You know, I'm reminded of the actual, as Ambassador Paula Dobriańska had mentioned in her opening remarks, I'm reminded of the actual proclamation itself, which went into effect on this day in 1959, on July 19th, signed by then President Truman. You look at the historical perspective, you look at the nations that were listed within that roll call of countries, of nations, under the yoke of communism at that particular time. And with that, I'm actually reminded of a very interesting quote that I came across in a lot of my reading about Russia and the way that Russia acts as a government and also its society. It was a French writer who had traveled the expanse of Russia and had met various entities within Greater Russia. He met with government officials, with civilian officials. He went from town to town. He went into the bigger cities and left himself notes on every single interview that he had. And one particular quote is very infamous within his book, and his book is this. The author is Marquis de Custine. The book is Letters from Russia. And the most poignant quote within that particular book is as follows: Russia lies, denies the facts, makes war on the evidence, and wins. Ladies and gentlemen, that particular book was written in 1839, 183 years ago. That same quote is as relevant 183 years ago as it is today. But what are we facing today? What are we facing? I applaud my colleague here, Marek, in terms of everything that he had mentioned about the historical perspective of the Russian Federation, of what Muscovy is as a principality, as its own entity back in medieval times. But right now we're dealing with a country that is under, Ukraine that is under an immense amount of pressure. Pressure from its own internal society, pressure from the West, and obviously when it comes to a war itself. July 4th and July 5th in Lugano, Switzerland, was a conference called the Ukraine Recovery Conference. And at this particular conference, the Prime Minister of Ukraine mentioned a very startling figure in terms of the recovery and the restructuring of Ukraine and reconstruction of Ukraine post-war would amount to $750 billion. That's the annual defense budget of the United States of America, which is 10% of our federal budget. Add some discretionary funds, you can almost go as much as 20% of our federal budget. That is a staggering and earth-shocking figure to actually comprehend. And this is the intent of what Putin is trying to do in terms of the utter destruction of a nation. This is true genocide, what we are seeing right now. Ukraine has already experienced the genocide in 1932-33 with the forced famine, the Holodomor, Stalin's forced famine. But 2 days prior to the actual physical onset of the war, Putin, in his address to the Ukraine, to the 10 stages of why Ukraine needs to be wiped off the face of the earth, He talked about classification of Ukraine. He talked about the symbolization of what Ukraine is, the discrimination, the dehumanization, the organization, a polarization, a preparation for the war, the persecution of people, the extermination of the Ukrainian nation, as well as the actual denial of its own existence. So all of this is predicated as well as not so much as a physical war, but it's also predicated in terms of a propaganda war. We often forget about the propaganda war. If the $750 billion is a price tag alone for the physical restructuring of Ukraine, I would say to you that the untold billions and potentially even trillions of dollars of damage that is done in terms of the massive disinformation war which is happening and emanating from Moscow is truly beyond comprehension. But where do we go from here? The fact is, I think for me personally, is we're looking at Putin and understanding this as a zero-sum game. For Putin, it's a zero-sum war, and therefore I would even say for Ukraine it has to be a zero-sum war. Understanding the concept of Putin will never necessarily negotiate until he has to negotiate. Well, what does that mean that he has to negotiate? Does that mean more casualties coming back in body bags to the Russian Federation? Does that mean pressure coming from the West in terms of its sanctions regime? Does that mean an entity such as the Russian Federation, which Marek at the very end of his comments has said he's not calling for the dissolution of the Russian Federation, but if you think about the actual captive nations themselves proclamation, talks about those captive nations even in today's Russian Federation. So there are many aspects here in terms of what a zero-sum game is when it comes to the war in Ukraine. Of course, right now, Ukraine needs to win the war. I think that's quite evident. Last week, a DoD spokesman spoke about the delivery of the HIMARS to Ukraine, the high mobility artillery rocket systems to Ukraine. Ukraine has received quite a few of them already and is actually making an impact. And in particular, the State Department spokesman, the Department of Defense spokesman had actually mentioned, quote, "I think that there has been significant impact on what's going on the front lines." If you think about the fact that the Ukrainians have been talking about a number of targets they're hitting, they're spending a lot of time striking them as well. This shows that for whatever Putin sees, he sees the ability of the West to unite around a concept of Ukraine, which is defending not just its own democracy, but defending democracy for the rest of the world. I'm reminded back in 2014, after the first war, and many people forget that the first war actually happened in February and March of 2014, when Ukrainian parliamentarians had visited the United States Congress and met with congressional members of Congress and senators. And I was privy to be in a part of that meeting. And in this particular meeting, members of Congress had basically asked the question to those Ukrainian parliamentarians, what do you want from us? What more can we do for you? And the Ukrainian parliamentarians had answered with an analogy of what just happened with them a few weeks prior. European parliamentarians had come to Kyiv. They had done their perfunctory meetings in the capital itself, but they were asking to go to the front lines. They themselves, these European parliamentarians, wanted to see what was happening on the front lines. They arranged the meeting. They went to the front lines. The European parliamentarians had asked those Ukrainian soldiers in the trenches, what are you fighting for? 3 very unique answers. The first answer is, I am fighting for my family. Very honorable, very noble. The second is, I am fighting for my country. Again, very honorable, very noble. That happens, we see that type of mentality, that sentiment here in the United States as well. The third answer shocked the European parliamentarians, said, and we are fighting for Europe. And if that was a war 8 years ago, which obviously was not defended as much throughout the European continent, our allies worldwide, and unfortunately now it is, 8 years later and 5 months into a truly staggering war. We have to think to ourselves, what is the next step? Is the next step for Ukraine a frozen conflict? I would hope not. I would hope that that would be the least of any type of iota of an idea of how to end this particular war. What does a frozen conflict mean? That Putin basically can start a war at any time and at any place. If there are frozen conflicts in the Transnistria region, if there is now a quote-unquote frozen conflict within Georgia, which 20% of its territory is occupied by Russia, if you think of today, 20% of Ukrainian territory is occupied by Russia, and call that a frozen conflict, I would say that obviously the next countries are out there in terms of what would potentially be another frozen conflict. I end by this. I end with the final thought in terms of all American policy, all policy of the Western world dealing with Ukraine, dealing with this particular war, has to be in defining the enemy. We have to understand what and who the enemy is. If you want to say who in terms of a personality, perfectly fine. To me, the most important is the what. The what is Russian imperialism. And if we do not understand what the actual reasoning for this particular war is, then we'll lose the war even before we actually begin. To conclude, I'd like to also mention that Putin himself, a few weeks ago, had actually equated himself or reminded the Russian people that he wants to be like a Peter the Great. Peter the Great, ladies and gentlemen, was one of the first ones that did expand the Russian territory into greater Europe. So watch out Baltics, watch out Poland, and watch out other countries of Central and East Europe if we're not mindful of what the actual enemy is. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. Brian, thank you.
Thank you, Milda. And thank you to the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation for hosting this event and for the invitation. It's truly an honor to be here. The problem with speaking after Marek and Michael is that all the clever points have already been made, but I'll do my best. And to start my remarks, I want to mark an anniversary. It's not a happy anniversary, but it's an anniversary nonetheless. This December marks the centenary of the foundation of the Soviet Union. December 1922. The Soviet Union was founded 100 years ago this coming December. And that founding was made possible by the Red Army's conquest of Kyiv earlier that year. And this, it may be a banal point, but I think it's a point worth repeating. Every Russian empire begins with Ukraine. Every Russian empire in history began with Ukraine. But no Russian empire in history finished with Ukraine. And so when the Ukrainians say they're fighting for Europe, as Michael just pointed out, and fighting for democracy, those aren't empty, hollow words. This is true. There is a lot riding on how this conflict ends. Now, then in 1922, the Ukrainians were divided between Reds and Whites. I lost count of how many armies occupied Kyiv between 1917 and 1922. We're in a different place right now. In 1922, the West was not engaged. Nobody in the West. There were not any conferences in Washington talking about the Soviet conquest of Ukraine in 1922. So we are in a very different place right now. But I do want to bring this up because I think this is highly relevant in terms of where this could go. The second thing I want to do, and also I want to add that Vladimir Putin's very cognizant of anniversaries. I've been following this man my entire professional life. He is very cognizant of anniversaries and symbolism, and he would love nothing more than to put the Soviet Union back together in the centenary year of its founding, at least in some form. He has Belarus, he's going for Ukraine now, and he's working on Georgia as we speak. The second thing I want to do is talk about the true roots of this war, the real root causes of this war. And I think it lies in the different paths of development that Ukraine and Russia have taken since 1991. Marek referred to the optimism we had. I shared that optimism. I realize now I was naive then. I was young and naive, but we shared this optimism. I had this optimism about Russia in the early 1990s. But if you go back to that period, specifically 1993 and 1994, and at that time, I'm intimately aware of this because I was traveling between Russia and Ukraine at that time. I was kind of traveling between the two countries at that time. Russia and Ukraine were experiencing absolutely identical political crises at that time. You had a power struggle between the president and parliament, and when the rules of the game had not really been worked out yet, and each was claiming supremacy. You had this, it was identical, what was going on in Kyiv and what was going on in Moscow. What was not identical, by any stretch of the imagination, was how this conflict was resolved in each country. We know how it was resolved in Russia. Yeltsin bombed the parliament. Well, there you go. There's a precedent for how this country is going to be governed, right? All of our optimism should have been shattered at that moment, but we in the West, myself included, saw this as a triumph for Russian democracy because we saw democracy then as keep these people who call themselves Democrats in power. But what it really did was create a situation of executive supremacy and create a situation where might makes right and where the rule of law is meaningless. In Ukraine, in contrast, remember, these crises were identical. In Ukraine, the crisis was resolved by early elections to parliament, early elections for the president. And those happened in the summer of 1994. And in the summer of 1994, the incumbent president of Ukraine, Leonid Kravchuk, lost the election and stepped down and let the victor take power, Leonid Kuchma. At that time, this was seen as a victory for Russia because Kuchma was from eastern Ukraine and a Russian speaker, and Kravchuk was from western Ukraine. So this was seen as a victory for Moscow, but no, it was a victory for democracy. That's what it was. And Ukraine's and Russia's paths of development from that crisis of 93, 94 in each country was kind of etched in stone. Ukraine developed along a democratic path, imperfect, 2 steps forward, 1 step back, but it developed along an unmistakable path. This was the root of this conflict, because that Russia could not tolerate this Ukraine. And that is the true root of the conflict. The third point I want to make, and this came out of an article I just read yesterday by Tatiana Stanovaya, which I recommend everybody read. It's in the New York Times. The headline is "Putin Thinks He's Winning." And what Tatiana does is she spells out what Putin's plan is going forward right now after failing miserably in the initial stage of the war. And his plan at the moment, according to Tatiana, who is very well connected inside the Russian elite and has very good sources, is that part one, of course, obviously, is to seize control of all of the Donbass. That's part one. But then part two is to wear down Western support using the energy weapon, and terrorize Ukraine into submission after this. So it's a kind of a 3-point plan. First, you seize the Donbass, then you terrorize Ukraine into submission and wear it down and wear down the West. Now, this may appear delusional from Western eyes, but it's not delusional from Putin's eyes. Putin believes that this is how this is going to play out, according to Stanovaya. A similar sentiment was in a very good Twitter thread, a 26-tweet thread by Leonid Volkov, who is a Russian pollster, who I don't believe is living in Russia anymore because I know what his political beliefs are, and I don't think you could stay in Russia with those beliefs. But this is where Putin is trying to take this right now. Whether he will succeed or not depends largely on us. Ukraine can hold this off if the Western support continues. If the Western support wanes, and if we start whining about energy prices and inflation and say, let's go back to business as usual, well, then we basically sealed Ukraine's fate. So a lot depends on us right now. I would also want to add that Putin is on the horns of a dilemma right now. He truly is. Because if you look at the Russian elite, you basically have 2 factions. You have one faction, which I'll call the kleptocratic faction, which effectively wants to go back to the status quo pre-war and continue stealing as they have been stealing and stashing their money in the West as they have been stashing. Their ability to be the kind of kleptocrats they want to be has been hindered by the sanctions. And they want an end to this regime. They don't care about Putin's political project. That's one faction. There's another faction, and there are people who are kind of fall into both of these camps, but there's another faction who I call the imperial faction. They want to restore the empire, and that is job one, and that is more important than kleptocracy. What is Putin doing? Well, he's not going to do what the kleptocratic faction wants, basically pull out of Ukraine and get the sanctions lifted and go back to status quo. But he also doesn't appear to be doing what the imperial faction wants, because for them, the Donbass isn't going to cut it. They want the military parade on the Krещатик. They want 1922 again. They want to return to the empire. So Putin has put himself in a position where he is pleasing exactly nobody. And that's a dangerous place to be in Russian politics. In some ways, in some twisted ways, it recalls the position Mikhail Gorbachev put himself in the late 1980s and early 1990s. You had hardliners who wanted to return to the old system, and you had people who then called themselves Democrats that wanted the whole system wiped out. Gorbachev was trying to preserve this kind of liberalized Soviet Union, which exactly nobody wanted, and we know where Gorbachev's fate was. So it's a weird kind of analogy to compare Putin to Gorbachev, but in this political positioning, this is where he's put himself in. And before I got the timer going, so I'm watching, I got another minute. My last point I want to make is, regardless of how this situation plays out, we are entering a new Cold War period right now. I tell my students at the University of Texas that we're about to enter a world that resembles more the world I grew up in than the world you grew up in. We're entering very familiar territory for me right now, except I didn't experience this early part of the Cold War. We're kind of in a 1947 moment right now. And what's being decided right now is where those lines are going to be drawn. Are they going to be drawn as I would prefer they be drawn on Ukraine's eastern border? Right? Is that where the new Cold War line is going to be? That's where I want it to be. Or is Ukraine going to be the new East and West Germany with a partitioned Ukraine? Or, God forbid, is it going to be along Ukraine's western border with Ukraine on the wrong side of the Iron Curtain again? How this war plays out will determine this. If Ukraine can emerge victorious, I think it's not going to just be a victory for Ukraine, because I think that will weaken Putin. We'll be in a 1989 type situation, and I can foresee a free Belarus in that scenario. In the event of a Ukrainian victory, I can envision a world in which there is a free Belarus. In the event of Ukraine's defeat, as each of the other panelists have said, everybody's got to watch their backs, from the Baltics to Poland and beyond. So on that note, I will stop. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Brian. Thank you for all of your insights. Okay, so we will now turn to the Q&A session. I would like to kindly ask our guests, if you have a question, please raise your hand, stand up and introduce yourself, and wait for the microphone to get to you in order for our live stream audience to hear it. And also, if you have a question whom you wanted to address to as well, please indicate. Thank you.
I am Peter Humphrey, an intelligence analyst and a former diplomat. I do want to point out that there is a huge, overwhelming factor here, which is the flat population of Russia. We've had 3 or 4 decades of that, and they cannot sustain the imperial project much longer because of that. My question is, Clausewitz points out that if you really want to defeat an enemy, there is invariably a single point of failure. And in so many of these situations today, that point of failure is represented by one man. When do we get the guts to repeal Executive Order 12333 and admit that this would make the world a far better place?
Who's the question to, or who would like to answer?
Are you talking about assassination?
Okay.
As I said, this is a question of a Muscovite culture. So assassinating means simply stalling. And you will have many disagreeing with you because, like under Bush, Pear, the devil you know is better than the devil you don't know, so let's save the Soviet Union. That was the official policy here after Reagan. Sometimes unspoken, but no, I don't think the Narodniki were right when they wanted to solve all Russia's problems by assassinating the autocrat. It's the culture. So I was very happy when Brezhnev died. I was in California. It was on my father's name day. So I thought my father was a political prisoner. What a great day. He rejoiced when he was back in Poland. But a single death can stall things. It won't solve all our problems, especially in this advanced stage. Now, I teach about mass murder prevention, and sometimes bad people need to go away. But the time for Adolf to go away was about 1929, 1930, when his National Socialist German Workers' Party showed electoral success. Also, since my family was involved in certain activities like this, special operations executive, when you make somebody go away, nobody should know. That person should be with Elvis and Jimmy Hoffa, alive somewhere, not just disappear from public space. These are just technical suggestions. So I think focusing on how to help Ukraine, sustaining them, is perhaps the best we can do. Eliminating a single person can help. For instance, in the Congo, before things metastasize, but then the problem is somebody else will step in, and not necessarily for the better.
I would concur with Marek on that. I mean, the Russian political strategist Gleb Pavlovsky, who was actually one of Putin's first original image makers, who later broke with him, said the Putin regime will fall someday. It will fall in one day, and it will be replaced by something exactly like it. And this is my. I mean, if Putin is assassinated tomorrow, who's going to be? I mean, we're going to be dealing with Patrushev maybe, or Shoigu, or God knows who. Right? We could be dealing with something even worse. So I don't think, and I would concur with Mark, the problem is Muscovite culture. It's Russian imperial culture. We made the same mistake at the end of the Cold War. We thought communism's gone, problem solved, end of history, cool. Wasn't. It was Russian imperialism. And right now, I think we have to be very careful about making the mistake that they're thinking the problem is Putinism. Just like communism was a manifestation of Muscovite imperial culture, Putinism is a manifestation of Muscovite imperial culture. To change Russia, we need what my good friend James Sher at Chatham House calls a revolution of the mind to happen.
Perhaps a counter-revolution, sorry to interrupt. We've had enough revolutions.
Right, well, okay, but I mean, a counter-revolution. Okay, that's fair enough.
We need going back to normal.
But I mean, Russia needs a catharsis. Losing in Ukraine could provide that catharsis, a decisive defeat. And it has to be decisive. It can't be ambiguous. It has to be a decisive, humiliating defeat. I get so tired of these comments from people like President Macron about how we should not humiliate Putin. Yes, we should. Yes, we should, because that's the only thing that's going to provide the catharsis that is going to change this country and to make its neighbors feel safe.
Oh, please go ahead. If you could introduce yourself, please.
Hi, my name is Ilana Mazurkevich, and I'm with the Ukrainian Human Rights Committee. And this will be directed to Michael and Professor Whitmore. As we all know, we've got a beautiful exhibit down there commemorating the genocide, the Holodomor of 1932-33. Now, Ukraine has been fighting a genocidal war for the past decades. Now, usually when a war occurs, it's to occupy a territory, but this war is to eliminate a people. So, Michael, is this a war for territory or a war for elimination of a people? And another thing, Professor Whitmore, you said that this is a Cold War. Don't you think this is a hot war when missiles are flying through a great majority of part of Europe and everybody's on alert? Would you call this cold or would you call it hot? Thank you.
You want to go first?
Uliana, thank you for the question. This is, in my comments, I had mentioned, I gave two drastic aspects of this war, that there is a physical war and there is a propaganda war associated with this. I would go so far in terms of a subset of even that propaganda war is a war of mindsets. And if we don't understand that this is a war of mindset, as Marek and Brian have mentioned as well extensively, that this is a most Muscovite culture, that this is it's embedded, it's enrooted within a Russian culture, this imperial aspect, this imperialistic policy, and eliminating just one person will not necessarily change that mindset. It's almost if we're in summertime right now, many of you have summer gardens. You know, one of the hardest things to do in a summer garden is to weed things out, right? So you don't just chop it off and think that the problem is solved. That would be that one person mentality. You have to actually extricate it from its roots. And that, I think, is what is absolutely essential right now in terms of why Ukraine needs to win this war. Because it has to be humiliated. Yes, I would agree. As a Ukrainian American, I may be biased by saying that. But yes, Russia has to be humiliated in this. Because that will send a signal to the Polands of the world, to the Balts of the world, and other countries of the world that they are, understanding of what is the mentality within the Russian Federation, within that imperialistic mindset. But also at the same time, Marek had mentioned, there are other countries in the world that are just waiting in the wings potentially for the signals that are given in Ukraine for them to do likewise. So to me, it's a war of mindsets. And unless we understand that, if we had a very strategic and focused policy during the Cold War, I think that war of mindsets has to remain right now as well.
I would take just briefly on the first question. I would say that there's these two things are not mutually exclusive. This is a war for territory, and this is a genocidal war to wipe out the very idea of the Ukrainian nation. These two things are not mutually exclusive. They're not mutually exclusive, so I think both are happening. On the Cold War, hot war thing, the Cold War refers to the global situation. There can be hot wars in the context of a Cold War. In the first Cold War, from 45 to 91, there were plenty of hot wars. There were plenty of hot wars in that. The Cold War refers to the global struggle, the normative struggle between two camps. So I would say also, these things are not. I recognize that there is a hot war going on in Ukraine right now. It's impossible to not recognize that unless you're completely delusional. There is a hot war going on in Ukraine, a genocidal hot war going on in Ukraine. This hot war is going to decide where the dividing lines in the future Cold War are going to be. Again, I said we're in a 1947 type situation right now. And those lines last time were decided in a hot war. And this time they're being decided in a hot war again. So I think the two are not mutually exclusive. Thank you.
Thank you. Could we pick up a couple questions perhaps, because we're running out of time, if that's okay?
I'm Sven Kramer. My question relates to the global impact, not just the
Could you speak up,
imperial
please? I'm so
impact.
sorry.
Not just the imperial impact of communism as practiced in the Soviet Union, as practiced in Mao's China, on the globe, not just on the immediate area. And Marxism-Leninism picked up Marxist global claims for revolution, for science, for knowledge, for tearing down metaphysical and political structures globally. And so when Lenin came in, he benefited from that global self-righteousness, missionary feeling, total self-confidence that history was with him and his small party that became a big party. These people came in by coalitions, whether it was Castro or Mao, to some extent, certainly Castro. Lenin came in with coalitions, also in Latin America usually, and then they made it a totalitarian system with one party, with a global mission that they, of course, imperially exercised in their neighborhoods and with associated allies. But it seems to me that the victims of communism have it right when they concentrate on that totalitarian ideology that then was picked up by systems which were authoritarian in their nature. And But for example, when the Tsarists dealt with Poland, they partitioned it. That means some Poland was left, not as what they thought it should be, but it wasn't entirely destroyed as an idea, and so the Poles could reconstruct their self-confidence. In Hitler's case, his picking up on German nationalism, and he called himself National Socialist, not just socialist, and Mussolini to Italy. They picked national pride, but they weren't yet communists claiming global ambitions. And that, I think, I'd like you to comment a little bit more on how the imperial drive of the Soviet Union was enhanced by the communist ideology.
The communist ideology gave the Muscovite imperial culture ideological justification. That's basically how I view it. And again, this is why I felt we made a mistake in the early 90s when we thought the problem was solved with the fall of communism in the Soviet Union, because the imperial instinct was never eradicated, and it was just going to remanifest itself wearing new clothes. So I see the communist ideology in a historical sense as an ideological justification for something that was already there, Muscovite imperial ideology.
Well, communism laid a claim to universalism, which expedited the conquest.
Yeah.
As far as German National Socialism, which, by the way, they picked up from the first National Socialist Party, which was Czech, not German, at the beginning of the 20th century, was not universalist until the Third Reich attacked the Soviet Union. Then suddenly, some of the top Nazis, in particular in the SS, realized they needed some kind of a first Nordic and then more widespread universalist dimension. Do you know the title of the main theoretical periodical of the SS? Vereinigte Europa. United Europe, the European Union. Oh, yes, this is not a joke. So Hitler was struggling to shift from a local parochial Germanic mobilization to something that would be akin to communism. Hence the co-optation of the Rexes and various shirt movements. I mean, more Danes died on the Eastern Front than in the so-called resistance. Everybody had an SS division except for Jews and Poles. Throughout the entire Europe. Nobody talks about it, of course, because the Third Reich lost, but so that's the difference. But socialism is socialism.
If I can briefly pick up on what Marek was saying. I'm sorry, Michael, did I cut you off? I mean, we are increasingly seeing this universalist rhetoric in Russian rhetoric. I would point to an article that was published a couple years back called Putin's Long State by Vladislav Surkov, who for a long time was Putin's chief ideologist. I'm not sure where he is in the system right now because he's kind of disappeared, but that's another issue. But in this article, he makes this argument that Putin has created an ideology that is going to challenge the West for supremacy, and that Putin represents the fourth great manifestation of the Russian state. After Ivan III, Peter the Great, and Lenin, he is the fourth manifestation. So he puts Putin in this line and uses universalist rhetoric. So this is the legacy of communism in current day Russia, is in this universalist.
And it's quite current in the right populist circles in the West.
Yeah.
Putin the catechon.
Yeah.
He is not LGBT.
Yes.
And that's what will save us.
Could I quickly just pick up, before I get another question, pick up on something that Brian said on Macron and the Western, old Europe. And you said, also we talked about the mindset of Muscovite culture, but how about the old Europe mindset, since they're so apologetic? And also Marek mentioned, the mentality that Europe starts from Germany. So how do we help, Ukraine if there's no unity in Europe, West between Eastern Europe? How do we find that common ground? Is that not an issue?
We listen to Eastern Europe is my solution to that problem. I mean, really, Western Europe doesn't know what it's like to live under Russian occupation. Eastern Europe does. And I think that we in the West, not those of us in this room, but broadly speaking in the West, I had an interesting conversation with former Estonian President Toomas Ilves about this, has been very condescendingly saying, oh, you cute little Balts and you cute little, you're still worried about this Russia thing. Isn't that, well, no, they were right and we were wrong, right? New Europe was right, old Europe was wrong. Old Europe doesn't know what it's like to live under Russian occupation. Eastern Europe does, and we should, going forward, we should be listening to our Baltic friends and to our Polish friends, because they got this right almost from the outset.
But we won't, because until
will.
something bad happens, no, I know, but in general, we won't, because until something bad happens, it's so surreal that we can't relate.
This is what Putin's counting on. We're
Yeah,
going to want to go
exactly.
back to business as usual.
Exactly.
Right.
And please remember the mess that Western Europe is in.
Yeah.
Complete cultural malaise, uncontrolled immigration, just lost souls. That's who they are. Many people in Britain thought Brexit would solve things. No, that's just the beginning of the game. Everything is enormous mess. The Spanish are more concerned about their lives and what's happening in terms of invasion from Africa as they perceived it. They don't care they don't care too much what's happening in Central and Eastern Europe. It took an enormous amount of pressure and encouragement for the Spanish even to send platoons or companies to rotate so that their troops could see what's on the other side of the lines. But that's only natural. When Charles Martel won at Poitiers, nobody cared except for the Gauls, the French. Nobody else felt the pressure of the Muslim invasions from Al-Andalus. That's how it is. Very few people can relate to the predicament of the Vietnamese people. That's just how it is. I'm not approving of it. I actually try to delve into those things and keep abreast, but we should not be surprised that nobody appreciates, or hardly anybody in Western Europe, that Ukraine is now on the receiving end and trying to protect everybody. This is just absolutely normal. When the Poles fought the Bolsheviks, most of the West was on strike, so there would be no military surprise coming to Poland. The Hungarian army gave up 90% of its ammunition to help the Poles. That's about it. The French talked big, but everything was bogged down. German workers were on strikes. Czech workers were on strikes on behalf of the young democratic Soviet Republic. And reactionary Poland was in the way. Sounds familiar? No, obviously. The Poles did prevail in 1920, but they had to compromise. They had to ditch Petlura. So how would I call them? Populist, National Socialists, Democrats of Ukraine with lowercase NNS.
Well, we have 1 minute left. If you would like to provide 15 seconds, last comments from our speakers, and we'll wrap it up.
Start.
Just remember the lessons of 1922. A lot's on the line right now.
I want to pick up on what Marek had said in terms of surreal. This is surreal. If you think about history is history, we read it in books, we can analyze it, but we're actually living this right now. So the surreal aspect is what we're fighting to make sure that this war needs to be won for the sake of all of humanity, for the sake of the big D for democracy.
1 second.
Amen.
And that is a wrap. I'd like to thank our panelists, please. Perfect. Okay, please stay for the next panel, The Lessons of Ukraine for Captive Nations Around the World, moderated by my colleague, Carlos Ponce.
Great Good job, my friend.
Take our stuff with us.
What's I'll take that.
Oh, nice to see you. Thank you.
Ready. Hello. I just want to call the panelists to join us, Arthur, John, Basil.
Thank you, John.
Well, let's continue the discussion. I want to welcome this extraordinary panel of experts. It's kind of bringing together what we have been discussing this morning. And it is about the lesson from Ukraine, how we can use this lesson from Ukraine in other captive nations around the world. We know about the good relationship between Russia and Venezuela, Russia and Cuba, sending oil to Cuba, Russia and Nicaragua, Russia and North Korea. So we know that there is already an impact, and whatever happens in Ukraine is going to have a major impact in the rest of the captive nation. With us today, we have an extraordinary panel. Hun Sen Lee Arthur from One Korea Network. He has a special expertise knowing the monster from inside, monster from North Korea from inside. He escaped with some of his family in 2014 and made his way to the U.S. Graduated in high school and teaching a foreign language and major in English. And upon graduation, he served the North Korea military for 3 years and 3 months. And he's currently the director in D.C. of the Korean Conservative Political Action Conference and One Korea Network. His expertise about Korea can give us a lot of information about the relationship and how the strengthening relationship between Russia, North Korea, and China. An old friend, Martin, the Ambassador Martin Vallos, is the director of the Václav Havel Program for Human Rights and Diplomacy at Florida International University and a member of the Prague Society for International Cooperation. He has many hats in his life. He has been working in an NGO sector and training leaders and thinkers. He served as the Czech ambassador to the U.S., and also, he had the honor to serve the Czech Republic permanent representative to the United Nations. And he also serves as Deputy Minister for Foreign Affairs for the Czech Republic. He always has been on the top of the game, concerned about Venezuela, concerned about Cuba, concerned about Nicaragua, concerned about North Korea. So he's inside about the impact from this war in Vietnam and another close nation. It's a fundamental take for today. And John Suarez, also an old friend, he always has been in fight for different countries, not only for his country, Cuba. He's executive director at the Center for Free Cuba, and he was the program officer at Freedom House, the Latin American programs at Freedom House. He has been in numerous TV, radio programs talking about the situation of this closed country, autocratic, communist country. And he also has been in a role of advocating for freedom in all this country. So let's begin with Arthur. Arthur, the impact of this war and this invasion in the rest of the captive nations.
Thank you very much for your warm introduction, Dr. Points. It is my extraordinary privilege to participate in the Captive Nations Summit this year. I'm so grateful for your hard work in remembering the victims of communism. Just talking about the victims of communist dictatorship and the people who are still being oppressed to this day makes my heart cry. Like the host's introduction of me, I was born in North Korea, one of the most oppressive regimes in the world, and I have lived for 29 years in the Gulag state. While living in North Korea, no one, including myself and my family members, knew what the communist dictators had taken away from us. No one told us the truth, and the voice from outside never reached us. It was because the communist dictators blocked our eyes, ears, and brainwashed us. The most precious thing to us what we lost, and the dictators took away from us, was our freedom and human rights. The 25 million people still living in North Korea could all end their lives without knowing why they have no freedom of movement, freedom of speech, freedom of ownership, and why they are executed by the regime, forced to work, and suffered from extreme hunger. Ironically, the tragedy that my family experienced in North Korea gave us the wisdom to seek freedom and leave the totalitarian regime. In 2013 and 2014, my father was astonished when he realized that Kim Jong-un executed his uncle with the machine gun and purged hundreds of officials. I also lost my friend and a college classmate, and my sister lost her roommate in front of her very eyes. Some were executed and many were sent to political prison camp, which is notorious in the world. Hundreds of government officials were purged, and around 20 members of their families were forced to be imprisoned for life in the camps. The entire country was shocked and by the new leader Kim Jong-un's brutality, and my family realized that this was not what we wanted from the leader, and it was not what we envisioned in our lives under communism and socialism. We concluded that there is a fundamental problem with the totalitarian dictatorship we lived in, and we thought about what we could do for our lives, for our families and relatives and friends, and decided to defect to the free world. Before I talk more about the evils of communism today, unfortunately, I have a sad news that I would like to share with you. A few days ago, the South Korean Ministry of Unification released photos and videos of two North Korean fishermen, defectors, who were forcefully repatriated to the North in November 2019. They were tied with ropes and taken blindfolded to the DMZ, demilitarized zone. When they saw North Korean soldiers in front of them, they registered and struggled not to be taken to North Korea side. Eventually, they were dragged by the South Korean government officials and handed over to the North Korean soldiers. The previous South Korean administration claimed that the two defectors were sent back to North Korea because they are brutal criminals who killed 16 people on the boat. Even the former Ministry of Foreign Unification of the same administration testified at the National Assembly hearing that, I quote, "The defectors said they would go back even if they were killed by the regime." In addition, the National Security Advisor of the same administration testified there was no sincerity in their defection and they were murderers. However, the photos and video clearly show that they were scared to death of going back, and no investigation and no legal procedure were conducted into this murder case in North Korea. In the end, the South Korean government notified the North Korean regime of repatriation just 3 days after they entered South Korea. And in 5 days, they were repatriated through the DMZ. According to my internal source, the two young men were reportedly executed in North Korea. I can't help but doubt my eyes and ears how the South Korean government can ignore the law and hide the repatriation of the defectors in a liberal, democratic, law-governed country and hand up those who are not even convicted to the totalitarian regime which killed its people by anti-aircraft machine guns. It makes me so angry that this can happen in the so-called human rights lawyer presidential government, which put forward the slogan of people come first. What makes me even more surprised and angry is that the former the President Moon Jae-in sent a letter to North Korean dictator Kim Jong-un inviting him to the Asian Korea Commemorative Summit that day when he notified North Korean reputation of those two fishermen defectors. Very terrible and unacceptable act, no different from the forced repatriation of North Korean defectors by the Chinese Communist Party and the Russian government for years was carried out by the South Korean progressive government. It made me cry all day. Looking at the photos and video of the fishermen, I recall the faces of my friend who was executed, the college bird who were taken to Polk prison camp, and my sister's roommate were taken by the North Korean agent in the school dormitory, including my other friends' faces that I have never seen since I left North Korea. Countless North Koreans have been victims of these dictators for decades, for 7 decades, and are still living as slaves in today's 21st century. As everyone here agrees, the suffering experienced by the victims of communism on a global scale by totalitarian dictatorship is beyond the description. And the atrocities of dictators still continue. The atrocities of the war that Russian dictator Putin is now committing against the Ukraine citizens should never happen or be tolerated. Putin's invasion of Ukraine recalls the past of Korean Peninsula. Kim Il-sung, the founder of the North Korean prison state, with the full support from the Soviet Union and Chinese Communist Party, started a war in the Korean Peninsula in June 1950, killing more than 3 million people and devastating the Korean Peninsula during the three-year war. Eventually, the Korean Peninsula became the longest divided country for 7 decades, and tragedy occurred in which it separates hundreds of thousands of families in the south and north. There is no if in history, but if communism didn't exist, if the Soviet Union and Chinese Communist Party had not helped North Korea, the North Korean people would have been free to live the same life as us. In fact, we all thought the Cold War was over, and when we saw the collapse of the Soviet Union and the fall of the Berlin Wall. But the Cold War has never stopped. It has only ceased fire like North Korea and South Korea, which have been in a truce for about 7 decades. The war has stopped, but North Korea has yet to abandon its goal of dominating South Korea, building asymmetric forces such as nuclear weapons, missile, and cyber warfare of decades. In addition, China and Russia studied the success of the Western world and sought and developed the ways to infiltrate and counteract the West more effectively using the liberal democratic system. They secured the capital, energy, strengthened the military power, and developed technology. In particular, China prepared for the new Cold War with the West by using various means, such as economic retaliation, while infringing on intellectual property rights and sovereignty and the territory of other nations. Also, they influenced American education system to brainwash the younger generations with communist and socialist ideology that will never work for those who have experienced the Cold War to destroy liberal democratic system. I was shocked at first. Many Americans have a perception that socialism is good. I couldn't get the idea out of my head that can they feel the same way if they lived through socialism and communism? According to my experience of living in a one-party dictatorship, communism, socialism, totalitarianism for 29 years, socialism and communism are never a system that provides and guarantees the freedom and human rights of their citizens improves the quality of life of their people. Rather, it is this system that works to limit and control freedom of their citizens by using so-called justice and equality, and to strengthen the power of dictators with armed force and surveillance. In the end, dictators hide their irrationality and lies of their communist ideology and thus create a totalitarian society and run the country with reign of terror for their long-term rule. Therefore, the era of totalitarian dictators' ambition for power and personal desire to kill countless innocent people must end by all means. Freedom is not free. If we don't fight for it, you will lose it eventually. We must fight for our freedom and for the oppressed people living under communism. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Arthur. Thank you for your words and your wisdom. Ambassador.
Thank you very much. First of all, thanks to the organizers for giving me an opportunity to participate in this important and very timely discussion. Let me start from a triviality. We have a question where we are now, almost 5 months after the Russian aggression called Special Military Operation in Ukraine. So on the one hand, we are facing the same problem. That's, I would say, precondition that we can discuss it. But we have to admit that we see this problem from different perspectives. And that these differences, I think, should be also taken into consideration. I just, by as an example, I had an opportunity to visit Latin America 2 weeks ago. I was in Mexico, then in Argentina, in Uruguay. Certainly, they have their own positions here. I don't want just to present here their positions, but I was very much aware of the differences of perspectives. John is going to speak about Cuba, but certainly Latin American differences are important. And if I look at our own region, I mean East Central Europe or Central Europe, again, historical experiences of Czechs, Slovaks, Poles, Hungarians matter, and they explain sometimes nuanced discussion, not unanimity, but maybe even differences that can lead into controversies. And we need to face this basic fact. So let me start from a common thing. I think that common theme we are talking about is totalitarianism. Hannah Arendt, one of the greatest political thinkers of the 20th century, always warned that if we want to think about totalitarianism, we have to admit that we have some difficulties to understand. Difficulties of understanding was her main point. There will be shortly another anniversary. There are some anniversaries being remembered here. In March of 1953, which means it will be 70 years next March, there was a major conference on totalitarianism organized in Boston in the United States by American Academy of Arts and Sciences. In spite of the fact that such conferences should be a rather academic exercise, the overall sense of mobilization was around. There was a mood of political crisis and urgency, as those who then published proceedings of this conference, Karl Friedrich and young Zbigniew Brzezinski's assistant. And the conference was opened, and I think it illustrates all, by a speech by George Kennan. And George Kennan said in his opening speech, I quote, "We have come together to discuss a phenomenon of our time that has brought the deepest possible misery to untold millions of our contemporaries, which has demeaned humanity in its own sight, attacked man's confidence in himself, made him realize that he can be his own most terrible and dangerous enemy, most bestial than the beasts, more cruel than nature." Did George Kennan speak here as a public intellectual, regardless of his actual position in the American political system, or as an official herald of American post-war realism in international affairs? What was more important for him
The shock supported by the well-proven empirical evidence that totalitarian dictatorships are materialized evil, transforming the human world into hell, or the fact that such regimes, because of their devilish nature, had to be regarded by the State Department as hostile to the United States. I think that we are still living with this question. But most important product of this conference was standard definition of totalitarianism. Still, if you want to ask your students what totalitarianism is, I think here it is 7-point long definition. But most importantly, what is said is that what is more important than, let's say, progressivism or conservatism of Nazism is certain forms of government. The form how this government is trying to subdue its subjects and radiate to the outside world its deadly race. Fascism, Nazism, and communism were considered as two varieties of one and the same species. I think it's extremely important if we want to understand the Russian case today. Many things have been said here already, and I have hardly found anything I could disagree with, so I'm not going to repeat that, except one thing. And one thing is a fascinating easiness with which Vladimir Putin switched from progressivism built in the traditions of communism and Lenin, his corpse, and the corpse is still in mausoleum on the Red Square. But I don't think that Vladimir Putin is a great admirer of Lenin. If you want to understand Putin, I think that we have to bring in Stalin first into consideration. And his crisis in 1941, when the Soviet Union was attacked by Nazi Germany, and Stalin, as a British historian Montefiore beautifully described in his book Red Tsar, was almost afraid that he would be eliminated by people around him. And instead of that, he was turned into a supreme commander-in-chief of great patriotic war. So here we have some sort of strange transmutation of totalitarianism. I don't agree with those who believe that communism is still ideological inspiration. Read people like Alexander Dugin, for instance. I'm not able to make a clear connection between Putin and Dugin, but Dugin is the author of this so-called fourth political theory. After communism, Nazism, liberalism comes Dugin. And many ideas of Dugin, if they are transformed into serious discussion between progressivists and conservatives in the Western liberal world, I think are relevant and important. So what I'm saying here is that there is a time for much more important and deeper and serious discussion on the nature of totalitarianism. This transformation from, let's say, Lenin's building of communism to Peter Great version of the Russian policies, that's disturbing, and obviously it has a lot of consequences geopolitically and in all possible sense. Check lessons in this context. Certainly we are influenced by our history. So in the case of this situation now in Ukraine, we have to think about our experience from 1938. The appeasement of Western powers with Adolf Hitler just to help German minority on the territory of Czechoslovakia that only destroyed democratic state and didn't stop Hitler from what he was going to do. And I can go to the situation after 1945. I can go to the situation in 1968, very importantly, when Czechoslovakia was given a lesson what does containment meant. Did containment mean in that situation? And then 1989, finally, our liberation from Babylonian captivity in the Soviet Empire. But what does it mean now? It means that we have to use these historical lessons in our current situation. that we have certain responsibility, maybe as a formerly subjugated nations, to participate effectively in a bigger discussion. Let me to remind you, and it's the end almost of my speech, what Václav Havel said in when he had the opportunity to address joint session of the United States Congress in February of 1990, long time ago. So what Havel said, the communist type of totalitarian system has left both our nations, Czechs and Slovaks, as it has all the nations of the Soviet Union and the other countries the Soviet Union subjugated in its time, a legacy of countless deaths, an infinite spectrum of human suffering, profound economic decline, and above all, an enormous human humiliation. It has brought us horrors that fortunately you have never known. At the same time, unintentionally, of course, it has given us sometimes positive, a special capacity to look from time to time somewhat further than those who have not undergone this bitter experience. Someone who cannot move and live a normal life because he's pinned under a boulder has more time to think about his hopes than someone who is not trapped in this way. What I'm trying to say is this: we must all learn many things from you, from how to educate our offspring, how to elect our representatives, how to organize our economic life so that it will lead it to prosperity and not poverty. But this doesn't have to be merely assistance from the well-educated, the powerful, and the wealthy to those who have nothing to offer in return. We too can offer something to you, our experience and the knowledge that has come out of it. What I'm saying is, have we delivered? I'm not sure. I think that we have not. And maybe this situation today is the highest time to make this promise, to implement this promise. So what I would like to suggest, why don't a big international conference is organized under the occasion of the 70th anniversary of this one in Boston? Because 70 years after, we are challenged by the same problem, but in a very different setting of the 21st century. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador. We have to end at 11:50 exactly. So, John, 5 minutes presentation, and then we can wrap it up. Thank you very much.
Okay. Cubans and Ukrainians have both suffered under communist regimes. Cuba today is a Marxist-Leninist dictatorship. Last year, on July 11th, tens of thousands of Cubans took to the streets demanding freedom and were met with deadly repression across the country. The aftermath: political show trials, militarized streets, new censorship laws, and hundreds of new political prisoners. Despite this, sporadic protests continue on the island. It is also important to mention that in 3 days we will be observing the day 10 years ago when Osvaldo Payar Sardinias and Harold Cepero Escalante were murdered by the secret police in Cuba. You can learn about Osvaldo in this building at the Museum of the Victims of Communism. But I want to review some lessons that I've taken from what has happened in Ukraine. And not just over the last few months, but over the longer term. And lesson number one, I'm going to reference myself and my colleague Frank Calzone. On January 16th, before the invasion took place, we authored an op-ed flashback to 1962, but Vladimir Putin is no Nikita Khrushchev and Joe Biden is no John F. Kennedy, in which we called on the Western world not to wait for an invasion, but to apply tough sanctions to avoid war. We returned to an earlier lesson given by Winston Churchill following the Munich Agreement, or as my Czech friends, the Munich Betrayal, when Western democracies believed they had achieved peace by giving Hitler parts of Czechoslovakia. And this is what Winston Churchill said at the time. You were given the choice between war and dishonor. You chose dishonor, and you will have war. Abandoning Ukraine in the short term may appear to guarantee peace, but the words of Winston Churchill should give us caution. Lesson number one: appeasement encourages more aggression. President Vladimir Zelensky in 2020, and this was on the question of joining the European Union, stated, "People don't really believe in words." Or rather, people believe in words only for a stretch of time, then they start to look for action. President Zelensky's observation made in 2020 applies today with Western promises of support for Kiev following Russia's invasion. Prior to the 2014 Russian seizure of Crimea, Ukraine did believe in words from the West. When negotiations between Ukraine and Russia broke down on removing nuclear weapons, yes, Ukraine had nuclear weapons to defend themselves back in the 1990s, and this was in September 1993, Washington engaged in a trilateral process with Ukraine and Russia that resulted in the January 1994 trilateral statement, where Ukraine agreed to transfer its nuclear weapons to Russia in exchange for security assurances, not only from Russia, but also from the United States and the United Kingdom. The failure of the West to restrain Russia from invading Ukraine in 2014 and expanding the war of conquest in 2022 gives a lesson to captive nations and others that giving up nuclear weapons in exchange for security guarantees is a foolish bargain. Putin's war in Ukraine is a blow against nuclear disarmament. By 2019, with regards to Russia and the West, President Zelensky observed in a Time interview, "I don't trust anyone at all." Many Cubans understand that statements condemning the actions of the Cuban dictatorship after July 11th without specific actions by the international community to hold the regime accountable will not end the ongoing repression by the dictatorship in the same manner that Vladimir Putin's aggression, when not met with strong resolve, did not stop that aggression. And the Christian Liberation Movement, Osvaldo Payá's movement that still exists in Cuba, offered 11 points of action to the international community to isolate the Cuban dictatorship, but the international community has failed to take action, and the Cuban dictatorship has steamed forward with its continued repressive practices. Lesson number 3, we must not confuse the dictatorship with the people. I'm quoting here President Zelensky from February 23rd, 2022. "I know that they, the Russian state, won't show my address on Russian TV, but Russian people have to see it. They need to know the truth, and the truth is that it is time to stop now before it is too late. And if the Russian leaders don't want to sit with us behind the table for the sake of peace, maybe they will sit behind the table with you. Do Russians want the war? I would like to know the answer, but the answer depends only on you, citizens of the Russian Federation." This was President Zelensky on February 23rd, 2022. Ukraine also provides an important lesson in distinguishing between the Cuban dictatorship and the Cuban people. Ukraine's Deputy Foreign Minister, Emi Dzapar, on February 27, 2022, tweeted, "The Foreign Ministry of Ukraine, in a diplomatic note, expresses its strong protest against the statements of the government of Cuba in support of Russia's aggression against Ukraine and calls on Cuba to urge Russia to put an end to this aggression." Free Cubans in Cuba, in contrast, are demonstrating their solidarity with Ukraine, criticizing the Castro regime's support for Putin's actions, leading to arrests by the political police. Many Cubans rejected and continue to reject this war, and they've been sending social media messages to the Ukrainian embassy in Havana, and also calling in to such a high volume that the Ukrainian embassy has asked Cubans to send their messages of support to a dedicated email address to not flood other messages from Ukrainian family members trying to get out. Cuban activist Pablo Enrique Delgado Hernandez, who met with the Ukrainian counterpart, with the Ukrainian diplomat, to deliver flowers in solidarity, was arrested by the National Revolutionary Police and taken to police headquarters, interrogated. And I'm going to wrap up with lesson number 4, the importance of disobedience. Liberation from dictatorships ultimately depends on the people's ability to liberate themselves. Gene Sharp, a nonviolent scholar, made that observation. And I will conclude by saying resistance to tyrants and refusal to obey them is key to achieving a democratic transition. And that sounds like a simple answer, and this is where I will close. There are no easy answers, but there are simple answers. We must have the courage to do what we know is morally right. Ronald Reagan. Thank you very much.
Yeah. Thank you very much, John, Arthur, Ambassador. We are wrapping up this wonderful conversation. I just want to give you 1 minute each one to finish, and just one question. What happens if Russia prevails, destroying Ukraine, advancing with the whole power? What's going to happen with all these countries, these captive nations, in a strong alliance with Russia and with China? Arthur, what's going to happen?
Yes, North Korea established a relationship with those two groups who are supported by Russia recently. So I think, the North Korea is still supporting the Putin, and they will side with till the end. They will never give up their power like Putin.
Ambassador.
There is in Czech tradition, challenge and warning made by Tomáš Garrigue Masaryk. The Czech question needs to be perceived in worldly terms, not just as a regional small thing, but a projection to what's happening around. Just saying here, John Suarez, I think that the biggest problem of Cuba is that Cuba is not perceived by many important players globally as important enough. That it is only just for Cubans who like their country. I think that Cuba has a historic opportunity and challenge to say that Cuban democracy of the future is in interest of all democracies in the world, because it's a criterion how totalitarianism and tendencies to totalitarianism can be defeated.
Good. John, your last word.
Unfortunately, if Putin is successful, we heard in the earlier panel, they will expand their aggression to other neighboring countries. But it's not only Russia. I also fear greatly for Taiwan. I think mainland China is looking very closely at what's taking place in Ukraine, and Taiwan would be the next target of another totalitarian figure. And God knows what other authoritarian regimes will also be acting in a more aggressive manner if they see they can get away with it, as Putin would have gotten away with it if he succeeds. Thank you.
Thank you very much, this wonderful panel. Thank you very much, all of you. Please remain seated for the awards ceremony.
Thank you very much.
Ladies and gentlemen, we are now going to begin our Dissident Human Rights Awards ceremony. Please join me in welcoming our incredibly distinguished guest, the First Lady of Ukraine, Mrs. Olena Zelenska.
Thank you. We are so excited to welcome you here at the Victims of Communism Museum. Thank you for taking a special time out of your day during this important trip to be with us. I'd now like to introduce a video by Congresswoman Marcy Kaptur. Representative Kaptur represents Ohio's 9th District and is a Polish American. She is currently the longest serving woman in the history of the U.S. House of Representatives and ranks among the most senior members of the 117th Congress. After working for 15 years as a city and regional planner, she accepted the appointment as domestic policy advisor to President Jimmy Carter. And in 1981, while pursuing a doctorate in urban planning for development finance at MIT, she was recruited by the Lucas County Democratic Party to run for Congress. In Congress, Representative Kaptur is a member of the House Veterans Affairs and Defense Committees, as well as the House Appropriations Committee. Representative Kaptur is the co-founder and co-chair of both the Congressional Ukraine Caucus and the Victims of Communism Congressional Caucus. She is a tireless proponent and defender of liberty around the globe. A message from Representative Kaptur.
In 1959, the United States Congress, in recognition of the global darkness imposed by authoritarianism, resolved that the third week of July would forever be designated as Captive Nations Week. This designation invited each and every American to appreciate the blessings granted by liberty and to endeavor to preserve and promote them for the benefit of all humankind. The American people understood, as the resolution declared, that communist imperialism makes a mockery of the idea of peaceful coexistence. Now, more than 6 decades later, the world is faced with imperialist aggression that is shaking the foundations of our modern era. With the Soviet Union vanquished and the pride of its despots shattered, Vladimir Putin has chosen murder and violence as the avenue to emerge from the ashes. Putin's unprovoked, unwarranted, and ruthless attack on the sovereign nation of Ukraine has solidified Russia's status as a criminal state. an outlaw that has relinquished any right of association with the community of democratic nations. Ukraine is now the scrimmage line for liberty on the European continent because tyrants do not respect rules or borders. As co-chair of the bipartisan Congressional Ukraine Caucus and an ally of all who yearn for freedom, I say here today that the United States' commitment to Ukraine and all her neighbors is steadfast and resolute. The world has been inspired by the courage of the Ukrainian people and their military. Ukraine's defenders have bravely laid down their lives so that her sovereignty will endure. And President Zelensky has the unshakable support of the United States. This war may not end as swiftly as we hope. But until it is brought to a close, the United States will aid Ukraine with the tools and resources she needs to persevere. And when Putin's bloody rage is finally beat back, America will be there to help Ukraine recover and rebuild. The depravity of Russian atrocities has shown the world that the great battles for freedom of the 20th century did not vanquish the specter of authoritarianism. Evil still walks among us today. Strong, active alliance between nations devoted to upholding the global rule of law is needed now more than ever. It will only be through our shared commitment to defending freedom and democracy that peace and stability will win the day. Ukraine's fight for liberty is the world's fight for liberty. On behalf of the Congressional Ukraine Caucus, I pledge that we will continue this fight until it is through and won. The United States will not cease any effort until Ukraine's liberty is safeguarded and the European continent is free of war once more. Today and all days we say, Slava Ukraini. Thank you all so very much.
Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Ed Fulner. I have the honor of being the chair of the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation. Mrs. Zelenska, thank you so much. You honor us with your presence today. We're delighted to hear from Congresswoman Kaptur from Ohio, who is a longtime supporter of our efforts here. And I would emphasize, of course, that the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation is genuinely and wholeheartedly bipartisan, Republicans, Democrats, independents, because all Americans come together, particularly today, in support of the people of free Ukraine. Five days ago, I was in Seoul, Korea, at the Asia Leadership Conference. The opening address was given by your husband on a video conference call to the 700 people at that conference. After his stirring words of inspiration and courage, he was followed by a panel including two members of Ukraine's parliament and the Ukrainian ambassador to Korea. I mention that because there we were in Seoul, a long way from Europe, where everybody thinks Ukraine and where the battle over Ukraine and the future of Ukraine is centered. In fact, it is a worldwide fight for freedom and democracy. For that, Madam Zelenska, we commend you, your husband, for his brave leadership, and all the people of Ukraine. It has been so encouraging to all of us to have stood by to be helpful to you, both, Madam Ambassador, as we have discussed in terms of both prayers and guns to help the Ukrainians fight for their continued freedom. Therefore, on behalf of my colleagues, it's my oh, here it is. It's my very great pleasure, Mrs. Zelenska, to present to you for the people, recognizing the people of Ukraine in recognition of their brave fight for freedom against Russia's war of aggression,
presented by the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation, Washington, D.C., July 19th. We thank you, we commend you, and we stand by you. Thank you. Can we do a board photo here, perhaps for 1 minute? You just stay for 1 minute. Dr. Edwards, our founding chairman. Dr. Spaulding. Thank you. Thank you so much. We look forward to your words.
Дякую, пане посол. Дякую, докторе Фулнер. Вітаю всіх присутніх. Для мене велика честь сьогодні бути тут і прийняти цю нагороду від імені кожного українця і українки, які зараз борються з російською агресією. Я знаю, що це вперше, коли цією нагородою відзначили цілий народ, до якого я належу. І для мене велика честь говорити від його імені. Комунізм.
Thank you, Mr. Ambassador. Thank you, Dr. Fulner. Good morning to all of you. It is an honor to be here and accept this award in the name of every Ukrainian man and woman fighting Russian aggression today. I know this is the first time that an entire nation has been distinguished with this award, a nation to which I belong. It is an honor for me to represent my nation here and speak on behalf of all Ukrainians.
Комунізм – це лише одна з форм тоталітаризму. Система, яка атакує вас, може називатися як завгодно. Але ми легко впізнаємо тоталітаризм за його головними ознаками – агресією, насильством, знеціненням людського життя.
Communism is just another form of totalitarianism. The system that attacks you can have different names, but we always recognize totalitarianism by its main features: aggression, violence, and complete disrespect and devaluation of human life.
Це саме те, із чим має справу Україна в особі сьогоднішньої Росії. Росія вже давно не називається комуністичною, але там досі практикують давні сталінські методи існування і поневолення інших народів.
And that is exactly what Ukraine is facing today because of Russia's aggression. Its present-day system has not long been called communist, but Stalinist methods of existence and enslavement of other peoples are still practiced there.
Тут у меморіалі є фото 3 українських дисидентів. Мустафа Джемільов провів 15 років в радянських таборах. Петра Григоренка примусово 2 роки лікували в психіатричній лікарні за те, що він поставив під сумнів культ особи Сталіна. Мирославу Мариновичу було 27 років, коли його засудили на 7 років колонії та 5 років заслання.
There are 3 photographs of Ukrainian dissidents who are exhibited in the halls of this museum. Mustafa Dzhemilov, the Crimean Tatar leader, spent 15 years in Soviet prisons and labor camps. Petro Grigorenko was forcefully subjected to 2 years of treatment in a psychiatric hospital because he questioned the cult of Stalin. And Miroslav Marinovich was only 27 years of age when he was sentenced to 7 years in labor camps and 5 in forced deportation.
Здавалося б, що це минуле, але ні. Саме це проходять українці прямо зараз в результаті російської агресії. 20-те сторіччя повторюється у найгірших формах.
One may say that it happened in the past and stayed there, but unfortunately it has not. Ukrainians are going through all this pain again as a result of Russia's aggression. The 20th century is repeating itself in its worst and ugliest forms.
Прямо зараз українці для того, щоб виїхати з окупованих територій, мають пройти через фільтраційні табори. Достатньо розмовляти українською, щоб не пройти фільтрацію. В окупованих містах та селах українську владу, що не погоджується співпрацювати з окупантами, викрадають, катують, вбивають. У містечку під Києвом голову громади розстріляли за те, що вона роздавала хліб і ліки своїм людям. Понад 1 мільйон українців насильно депортовані до Росії.
Right now, in order to leave occupied territories, Ukrainians must go through filtration camps. And it is enough for you to speak Ukrainian to be disqualified and fail the test and be let out. In the occupied cities, Ukrainian authorities who refuse to cooperate with the invaders are tortured. In a town near Kyiv, the Russians shot a local mayor just for distributing bread and medicine to the people. Over 1 million of Ukrainians were forcibly deported to Russia already.
Тож наше вистраждане послання світу. Пам'ятайте, що найтемніше минуле легко повертається. А подекуди воно нікуди не зникало. Просто навчилося користуватися більш сучасною зброєю та соцмережами.
So having passed through all this suffering and pain, we send a strong warning to the world. Remember, the darkest past can be easily repeated. In certain places, the darkness has never faded away. It just figured out how to operate more advanced weaponry and use social media.
І зараз ми боремося із новим тоталітаризмом не лише за свою свободу. Ми боремося, щоб сталінський великий терор не повернувся і більше не зміг використовуватися ніде і нікуди в цивілізованому світі.
And so we're not only fighting for our freedom today. We are fighting so that Stalin's great terror would no longer be repeated anywhere and ever in the civilized world.
І я дякую за визнання цього. Дякую за нагороду. Ви ще раз нагадуєте світові про сміливість та чесність нашої боротьби.
Thank you very much for acknowledging our heroic fight. Thank you for the award, because by bestowing it on us, you once again reminded the world about the courage and honesty of our struggle.
Thank you.
Thank you. If I could ask everyone to remain seated as the First Lady and her delegation, as they leave, I think, for the next appointment on their diplomatic visit. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, that concludes the panel discussions and award ceremony portion of our Captive Nations Summit program. And I'd now like to invite you to remain in your seats, and you will enjoy a traditional Ukrainian dance performance from the Carpathian Ensemble of DC. And immediately following the performance, you are invited to join us for lunch in the salon next door. Thank you.
Thank you.